Okay, so good morning. For the record, this is Alejandro Figueroa for the Puerto Rico Energy Commission. We begin this clarification conference call at 10 a.m. on April 21st, 2016. This call is held in relation to the Puerto Rico Electric Power Authority's Revitalización Corporation's verified petition for restructuring order, case number CEPR AP 2016-0001. Also present on behalf of the Commission are Scott Hempling and Ralph Smith, both Commission advisors. This call is held in response to a request made by the Corporation's Council on April 19, 2016, and with the purpose of clarifying some of the questions included in Attachment A of the Commission's second request for clarification issued on April 18, 2016. This call is being recorded for public scrutiny purposes, and as such, I ask that before speaking, you state your name for identification purposes. And now I turn to Mr. Hempling, who will be moderating the call. Scott?
Sorry, that was the mute button. This is Scott Hempling. My job is to coordinate the responses from our side so that we don't talk at once. And I understand, Glenn Rippey, there'll be somebody from your group that will be doing the same.
Yes, sir. This is Glenn Rippey, counsel to the corporation. Yes, Noah Caswell, who is a financial consultant to the corporation and was involved in the preparation of materials along with Mr. Michael Mace, who was one of the corporation's witnesses, will be coordinating the responses. I also...
Go ahead.
I also sent a brief email yesterday identifying items Roman numeral 1A, 1 through 1A3, 1D1 through 1D2, 3A1 through 3A2, 4B, and 5A2 as the specific items that we had questions on that we hoped could be clarified. As I said, and I believe as Attorney Figueroa made clear as well, this call is for clarification purposes in regards to a request for information made in a commission resolution and order, and of course nothing said on the call is intended to replace the full written answer that we will provide in accordance with the commission's direction. With that, Scott and Noah, I think it's best if you proceed.
Yeah, Noah, this is Hempling. Why don't you go ahead, please?
Okay. Thank you both. This is Noah Caswell from Milstein & Co. I'm also joined here by Josh Mendelson, also from Milstein. And as Glenn mentioned, we helped provide some of the financial inputs contained in the petition. So before we start off, I would like to thank the Commission for taking the time to speak with us this morning. We really appreciate the opportunity to clarify these questions as we go about answering them. So I think it makes sense to kind of jump right in, although before I do, Glenn had also mentioned in his email that there are two work papers that I think will be very helpful in working through our questions. So those two work papers are titled, the first one is titled 2016-04-15 SPV Petition Exhibits Backup v Share. And the second one is titled 2016-0329 PREPA Debt Service Projections V3. Is everyone aware of these files, and does everyone on the call have access to?
Ralph, do you have them?
Yes, this is Ralph Smith from Larkin Associates. I do have those files, and I have them both pulled up on my computer.
Okay, fantastic. So we are going to point out a few points in those files as we kind of move through, so that should be helpful. So why don't we start with the first question that we highlighted, which is 1A1. And this is a question regarding the number of status quo bonds and how many are expected to remain at PREPA under the restructuring scenario. So by way of background here, and this is addressing, I believe, exhibit attachment 3.03 in the petition. And we want to provide a little background here and then see if we can clarify this question. So the question asks how much of the 7.921 billion status quo amount is expected to remain at PREPA under the restructuring scenario. So the materials that we provided, in particular the attachments and the exhibits, only pertain to bonds that we expect to be transferred to the corporation. The 7.921 does not represent PREPA's total balance outstanding today. So first, to clarify the 7.921, if you do look at that attachment, one sec. If you're looking at attachment 3.03 in the section titled Principal Balance as of 7/1/2016, this amount represents bonds that are expected to be transferred, as well as an illustrative refinancing concept of 901 million. And we want to make sure it's clear that that 901 million doesn't exist today, but rather represents bonds that would have to be issued if PREPA did not have this broader restructuring plan. Now, I think...
Excuse me, can you focus us in on where this number is occurring?
Sure. So if you are looking, there are a couple places where you can see it. If you're looking at attachment 3.03, and you see there's the principal balance as of 7/1/2016. You with me so far?
No, just hang on a sec.
Sure. I can also point it to you in the Excel if that's easier.
Which page on 3.03, please?
Page 1.
My 3.03. Oh, right, got it.
I've got the 3.03 up. I'm looking at page 1.
Yep.
So where you mentioned 9.
So if you're looking at the principal balance as of 7/1/2016, the bottom section, there are two tables. And there's the 7921 number, there's a build to it. And you'll see there's 901 million labeled refinancing.
Okay, I'm seeing it.
Okay, so that 901 million does not represent bonds that are actually outstanding today. Those would be required to be issued if PREPA didn't have the corporation and didn't have the securitization transaction. So this is a concept in order to compare debt service profiles. So I think that the question the question here about how much of the existing PREPA debt is still outstanding really gets to, one, how much PREPA debt is outstanding today, which we can direct you to, and then two, how much of that debt do we expect to remain at PREPA. So where we can point you to that is if you open up the Excel file 2016-0329 PREPA debt service projections.
Got it.
And you open it up to the principal tab, this presents the fulsome PREPA and SPV debt service schedule, which differs from the materials included in the attachment, which are only designed to show those bonds that we expect to be related to the corporation. Here, those are referred to as affected bonds. So if you look at row 21 of the Excel, and you're in column F, you'll see at the end of 6/30/2015, the balance at PREPA was $8.839 billion, and that is still the balance outstanding today. And our question then would be, if you look in the restructured principal balance section of that Excel, this also separates out what will be unaffected or will remain at PREPA based on our understanding of the transaction today, as well as what we do expect to be part of the transaction. And that you can find for the total principal balances, you can see those in rows 35 for what will remain at PREPA, and row 43 for what will move to the SPV and be part of the corporation. So our question here is, we think this is the distinction that the Commission is trying to understand. So would it be responsive to your question here to direct you all to this part of the working paper?
It seems like you've explained the 7.921. And is that what you think you've answered so far?
Well, I guess what my question here is, it seems like, is the question here to explain the 7.921, or is it to explain which bonds are staying at PREPA and which bonds are moving to the SPV?
And Noah, this is Glenn. Sorry to interrupt. It might be helpful if you'd refer back to the specific, because we identified like nine of the information requests that we're going to talk about, just to make sure we're on the right one.
Sure. So if the question is, there's a separation in where we break out the numbers that will remain at PREPA versus what will transfer, and that's included in 2016-329 PREPA debt service projections V3. And that's where we think it addresses what I interpret as the more fundamental question of how much of PREPA's existing obligations will remain at PREPA, which is a different question than the one asked here, because the answer to how much of the 7.921 would be all of it except for the illustrative refinancing that we discussed. So I just want to understand which of those questions you're really trying to ask here.
Okay, so the 7.921 includes the 901 million that's not currently PREPA legacy debt.
That's correct.
And
so
you've referred us to the 2016-329 principal page, line 21, which has 8.839 billion of PREPA. Now, is that existing PREPA legacy debt?
Exactly.
Okay, and then I think you're trying to explain how further down in this same spreadsheet, that 8.839, how much of that is going to be corporation refinance debt? In other words, that's being securitized and reissued, and then how much of that would remain at PREPA?
That's right.
Okay. And I think you said that the amount remaining at PREPA is the line 35?
Yes.
Which you're calling unaffected?
Yes. So specifically, at the close of the transaction, it would be the amount in cell G35, the 1595.
Not the 1669?
No, that includes amounts that will be paid off at the end of the year. That won't be part of the transaction.
So
at the end of the fiscal year, sorry.
Okay, and then the 6846 on line 43 is the amount that would effectively be retired and covered by new debt issued by the corporation.
Well, that is the new debt at the corporation.
Oh, so this is the amount at the corporation.
Yeah. So in this lower section, rows 27 through 43, that amount is in the restructured scenario.
All right, I think we're following it so far.
Great.
So go ahead.
No, please.
I was saying, so Ralph, the question is, do we feel that these folks with this oral answer this is Hempling, have answered 1A1?
I think so, yes.
Okay, great. So then moving down the list. So I would say that there were two. So the second question is 1A2. The restructured scenario lists 6.846 billion as of 7/31/2016. Please reconcile that 6.846 billion with the total amount of bonds that could be issued, which totals over 12 billion as listed in the next question. So this gets at a fundamental issue that we want to make sure that the Commission understands, which is that the categories of bonds that that we outlined and the maximum amounts are not by any means the amounts that we intend to issue in aggregate, and that these categories are not additive. In other words, there is no scenario where we would have to issue the maximum amount of all of the types of bonds. So I'm happy to walk you through an example of that so you can start to understand why we built in this flexibility. So would that be helpful?
Sure.
Okay, so I think the easiest way to look at that is the exchange bonds, the exchange offer bonds, and the cash offer bonds. So these bonds are essentially substitutes for each other. In the event that we are able to issue as many exchange offer bonds as we could, meaning that all participants in the transaction, in order to reach the minimum threshold or exceed the minimum threshold, were to exchange their bonds, we would not have to issue any cash offer bonds. So though the number of exchange offer bonds would potentially increase, and obviously would never exceed the 4.97 we have listed, the cash offer bonds could potentially be zero. And this works vice versa. In the event, and I think what we would view as probably the more likely case, that we do issue cash offer bonds, that would effectively reduce the amount of exchange offer bonds that we need to issue. So in that way, there is no real scenario where we have to issue 12 billion of bonds. We have to create the flexibility to do this because we don't know what the different scenarios are. Or rather, we know what the scenarios are, but we don't know where the ultimate deal will shake out and what the final construct will look like. But we do have some very good ideas about the ways in which it could go, and we needed the flexibility for that. So I don't think necessarily that there is a way that we can reconcile exactly to the 12 billion here. What we could do, though, is clearly identify, because in the exhibits that we provide, as well as in attachment 3.03, where we show, in that same principal balance section on page 1, where we show the restructured principal balance of the 6846. Some of our categories of bonds differ slightly just in nomenclature from those listed in the petition. So I'm wondering if it would be responsive to your question if we mapped how those categories match into the categories of bonds we are authorized to issue.
I think that would probably be helpful, and then some further explanation as to the potential displacement and kind of like the range of what could be issued for each of these types. And you said that you're not going to issue the 12 billion, but is there an upper limit on what would be issued? And are some of these fixed? Others are like one could substitute for the other, like the exchange and cash offer bonds. It seems to be the more the exchange offer bonds are issued, that'll displace cash offer and vice versa.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so it sounds like what you're saying is we would do the mapping and then explain some of the need for the contingencies above what we show currently?
Yes, I think the mapping will definitely help. And then I guess it would help to know what the maximum amount of bonds that's going to be issued is. Is that limited to the 6.86, or it looks like it could go above that?
Yeah, I think we do contemplate that it could go above that under various scenarios. So we could we could think about a way to put together an answer for a higher limit or give higher ranges, if that's helpful.
I think that would be helpful. And so you said you're probably not going to issue 12 billion. But then what would be the upper end of the range?
I think we'll have to go through that, because there are a number of different scenarios here. So one of the other things I'll point out is just by the very nature of it won't be 12 billion, that also automatically reduces the not to exceed amount, the 6.25%. So that number comes down automatically. Some of these other categories, will be the amounts shown. The self-insurance fund will be $50 million. The mirror bonds will be $2.086 billion. And then and then where it starts to really depend on the scenario is the number of exchange bonds, the number of cash offer bonds, and the number of other mirror bonds, and then how much we ultimately will need for the bonds not to exceed. And then the other pieces, I guess, rather the lender bonds, those we should speak about. That's one area that relates to bonds that we currently don't expect to issue at all, but could. And the only reason we would do so is if the current holders of PREPA's fuel lines prefer that to a termed out schedule at PREPA. So that's their option. And that would not be, that they would be taking an immediate haircut on those amounts. That would, again, be a reduction of the, relatively speaking. But, we can endeavor to think through what kind of the higher bounds are, if you think that that is responsive to the question.
Yes, I think some further clarity on what the upper bounds are is what these questions are trying to understand.
Okay.
Noah, this is Hempling. To clarify what you just said, so we know that the upper level is not going to be 12 billion because that's not a real number. That's not an additive number. We got that. What I think I also hear you saying is that as a practical matter, the upper limit is not knowable at this time because it depends on the interactions between offerors and offerees. Is that correct so far?
In some regard, the other factor that, and the other reason that we needed some flexibility was the potential timing delays. And just to speak about that for a moment is in the event that this transaction doesn't close when we expect it to, and we have to account for things like accrued interest, where essentially we would be converting what we would normally expect to be interest into part of the principal balance. That's one of the other flexibilities. And I would say that's probably the most unknowable piece. Aside from the, interactions with, with existing holders and knowing, what that total ultimately is and what participation levels is, and you're completely right that part is also quite unknowable. The potential timing delays of the transaction are also unknowable. And the reason that we wanted flexibility for that was we didn't want to have to, force the commission to review another petition later on down the road. We wanted to create, one that would allow us to work within its confines, even if the transaction is delayed.
Okay. This is Hempling. I want to raise a question that you're not going to need to answer now, but is in this context, and it's possible I'm supposed to know the answer, but when all the dust clears, what is the earliest date on which the corporation will impose the charge and the charge will appear on ratepayer bills? Can you keep that question in mind? You don't have to answer it right now, but it will help the Commission anticipate, especially with regard to interactions between the transition charge and the rate case. So the question to keep in mind is what is the earliest possible date on which the transition charge will be imposed by the corporation and then show up on bills sent to customers?
Yep. We'll mark that question down. I think actually there are other folks who are more qualified to answer that question than me. As we're not as close to the rate making process, but we understand the question. We can work towards an answer.
Thanks. Go ahead, please.
Sure. So I think we understand what would, how you'd like us to respond on to. So then moving to 1A3, this is really quite similar, for asking for projections for debt service from issuance through retirement by year for each of the bond issuances. So I think as we talked about, on the prior question, that there's some mapping that we need to do to make sure you understand how what's in our exhibits ties to the categories shown there. So what I would wonder is, would it be responsive to provide that mapping, in either an Excel exhibit or otherwise, to explain how the numbers shown in, either exhibit 3.03, which has the debt service schedule, or in the Excel related to 3.03, which is 2016-415 SPV petition, exhibits backup be shared, and the exhibit 3.03 debt service schedules tab. So I can give you guys a moment to take a look at that.
You're referring us to the debt service schedule tab on 2016-329?
That'll work too. On either of these Excel files show this information.
Okay.
So if you use that schedule and you look in rows, and actually the number that you would look for debt service would be the amounts shown in row 116. Rather, beg your pardon, it would be the amount shown in 114. 116 includes debt service that's remaining at PREPA. So 114 would show those amounts. And then if you also wanted to include any additional fees related to the transaction, that would be in 127.
The 114 shows the debt service for the corporation's bonds?
Correct.
And 127
that shows the same amounts, but also includes the items identified in row 118 for titled plus surety replacement and fees. So these are, the other fees related to the securitization. So if you want to include the total debt service as well as the fees, that would be the amount in row 127. So
there's a quarterly fee starting in the quarter 9/30/16.
Yeah.
And the annual surety premium, these are in millions, I think.
Yes.
That'll be paid at the end of the quarter 6/30/17.
Yes, that's right.
Okay, I think we're following that.
So our question would be, if we provide the mapping to these categories, and it may also be easier to see some of this in the other Excel file we sent you that has where it matches Exhibit 3.03 exactly. That may just be a little cleaner. But in either case, if we map the categories in the petition to those shown here, would that be responsive to the request for the debt service schedules?
I think so.
Okay.
And since we're talking about 1A3, I think earlier you were explaining that some of these categories are fixed and others are flexible. Can you just walk through the A, that's the exchange bond offer. I've got that one marked as flexible. The mirror bonds, the 2.086 billion is fixed. The mirror bond, the other mirror bonds are flexible. The PREPA self-insurance is fixed.
Correct.
And then I also had marked the bonds not to exceed, the item in Part H, as being flexible.
Yep.
Can you provide any insights on the EFG items?
Sure. Yeah, so the cash offer bonds work in tandem with the exchange offer bonds. So it depends on what the ultimate transaction looks like. But if bondholders with whom we're not currently speaking are more interested in taking a cash payment today instead of receiving exchanged bonds as part of the schedule, this contemplates that we would issue new bonds, these new cash offer bonds, to tender for existing PREPA legacy bonds. So the number of those bonds will depend in part on the number of exchange offer bonds that we issue. Because if there's sufficient participation in exchange offer bonds, we may not issue cash offer bonds. The other factor here is it depends somewhat on pricing. So the exchange offer bonds, as you know, have a fixed 85% of par exchange offer. However, cash offer bonds present the opportunity to essentially capture a greater discount. We don't know if that will happen. I'd be very cautious around that. We don't know what pricing would be. But the number of bonds, of cash offer bonds, we ultimately have to issue to retire existing PREPA bonds will vary somewhat with what the market pricing is. Does that help address the variability in cash offer bonds?
Yeah, it does. It sounds like it's kind of like a seesaw or a teeter-totter. The more exchange offer bonds, the less cash offer bonds, and vice versa. Yes,
that's a good way to think of it. Then for the lender bonds, this one we know what the total amount that could be issued is, or we have a pretty good idea there. These are bonds that are exchanged for PREPA's existing working capital lines that are already past due. So these are, this is essentially bank debt, and it includes bonds that are owed to, or rather, loans from the GDP, a small portion of them. So under the terms of their agreement, what we expect them to do is take a term out that we've agreed to already, and to remain at PREPA and receive that term out.
So Noah, this is Glenn. You probably want to briefly explain what a term out is.
Sure. So we have reached an agreement for a scheduled plan to repay those obligations over time. which which is based on discussions that we've had with those lenders. As I say, these loans were supposed to have come due. I think I'd want to double check the year, but a significant amount of time ago, and we have not repaid them, and we have agreed to a payment plan on them. However, the lenders received the option to exchange into these lender bonds rather than take that payment plan. So if they elect to do that, then they will receive lender bonds. So the lender bonds and how we have projected this amount, we currently don't expect to issue lender bonds. We haven't heard from them that they plan to do anything other than the payment plan at PREPA over time. However, they still have that option, and if their thinking changes for any number of reasons, they may want us to issue lender bonds. And it's also important to note that there are a number of different holders, or rather a number of different lenders, of those loans. So it may be a portion of those lenders that want lender bonds, or it may be all of them, or it may be none of them. So does that help clarify the lender bonds?
Yes, it does.
Okay. And then the last piece for Syncora.
We were viewing these lender bonds as the fuel line lending. Is
correct.
That's what it is, isn't it?
Yep, that's right. So if the fuel line lenders elect to exchange into lender bonds, those are the right things to match up.
And the $0.625 billion, does that reflect the existing amount of debt with the 85% factored in for the haircut?
Yes, that's right. So the existing amount is around $731 million. So this reflects the haircut, and some other flexibility, some other cushion, essentially. Then the last category is Syncora bonds. So Syncora is one of the monoline bond insurers. We have not reached an agreement with Syncora. We don't know what that agreement will ultimately look like. We're in the process of negotiating with them. And for that reason, we have included a number that we think is going to be higher than what it ultimately turns out, but we don't know. So we wanted to give ourselves cushion and flexibility in case we do want to do a transaction with Syncora. We could also move forward without doing a transaction with Syncora. So we've currently, put in a number that we think gives us the flexibility we need. But what's important to remember here is we can move forward with or without Syncora. So we would only do a transaction that includes them if it's beneficial.
So getting back to the earlier Excel file that we were referencing.
Yes.
If the Syncora doesn't opt into this deal, the PREPA legacy bonds that were insured by Syncora would then remain with PREPA. Is that right?
Correct. So if you look at the file that we were looking at before, and you see the insured bonds, if you look at the debt service tab, and you look at the restructured debt service section and go to row 69, if you look at those amounts, those correspond to debt service going forward, those correspond to debt service on Syncora bonds. So if you look at the principal amount in, I think, row 69, and then the interest amount in row 87, there is some debt service in earlier years, in the first year, that relates to other insurers, and this is a peculiarity of the securitization that we can get into. But the more relevant piece is 6/30/2017 and forward. All of those amounts relate to Syncora because at the moment we expect them to stay at PREPA because we don't have a deal with them.
Noah, this is Alejandro.
Yeah.
I have a question regarding the lender bonds. You're saying that there's no agreement with them for an exchange on their current debt for lender bonds, correct?
Not quite. So there is an agreement for what that would look like. You know, we know what rate they would exchange at, and we know generally that the terms would be similar to those of the exchange bonds. What we don't know is who is electing, if anyone, to take the option of exchanging into lender bonds instead of taking the payment plan we've agreed to.
Okay, and until when would they have to elect to go into this to exchange for the lender bonds, or is this something that they could do at any point during the effectiveness of the transition chart?
I would want to, refer to the RSA to double check, but so I think I'd rather do that. I don't think we expect it. I think that they would have to make a decision and then move forward with that payment, with that option. I don't think they retain the option over time, but I'd want to, refer that to the RSA and make sure that, we have the date correctly. So we can, look for a response to that.
Okay, so yeah, that's fine. If you can include it in what would be your answers, then that's fine.
Okay.
Thank you.
This is Hempling. Clarification here. I think this question goes to Alejandro. With respect to as we work our way through today's document and the corporation gets an affirmative answer to the question, quote, does this oral explanation satisfy you, close quote, is there any obligation of how should the corporation handle their obligation to answer these questions in light of this conversation? Alejandro.
Well, Scott, before Alejandro answers, I just want to say, as I said at the beginning, this is Glenn, our view is that this call is for clarification purposes and to give us an indication of what should be covered in the written answer. We do not intend it to be a replacement for the written answer. From my perspective, when Noah asked that question, we're asking for confirmation that if that content is reflected in the written answer, we have in fact given you what you need and want. And with that, I'll defer to Alejandro.
I think that answers my question. Thank you.
All right, so yeah, I guess we can go on then.
Okay. So for question, I guess now on 3D. Sorry, I may have mixed up the order here. Sorry, it looks like 1D1.
Say that again.
Question 1D1, refer to attachment 3.03 is section table entitled Benefits of Restructuring. So this deals with 3.03 where we, discuss, comparing and contrasting the debt service schedule under the securitization, at the corporation versus the same bonds if they were still at PREPA. So the question here is, please explain why the analysis extends to FY 2026, yet the new bonds will be outstanding for a longer period, i.e. through 6/30/2041, as shown on attachment 3.02. And actually, I think it probably makes sense to look at D1 and D2. And D2 is, was any analysis done for the full bond period, i.e. through 6/30/2041? What were those results? So for this, what I think it makes sense for us to do is refer to, in Excel, if you go to the 2016-04-15 SPV petition, exhibits backup, B share, and we're going to be looking at the tabs titled EX.303 debt service comparison and EX.303 debt service schedules. So the first of the, do we have the Excel up? You know which one I'm referring to?
Yes, I've got that as well.
Yep, Scott.
So this the first tab, the -DS comparison. This is just the same comparison that we include in in attachment 3.03, and this provides you with the backup for that. So one of the things that I think we wanted to address is, and the way that I think we would respond to the first of these questions, why 10 years, is that was in line with the goal of, of this restructuring, of providing, PREPA not only with, a better debt service profile, but one that allows it to make investment in, needed improvements and to really revitalize PREPA and make some of the other expenditures it needs, as opposed to so much in debt service. This is also the concept by the 5-year interest-only period on the exchange and cash tender bonds, again, to create some of that room. However, we didn't want to only show 5 years because we recognize that they do have to pay principal, and we want to account for that too. So we showed a longer period there to both address the reasons for the transaction, as well as to, be responsive to the realities of the transaction, that we wouldn't, this transaction would not be justified if we were doing the, if we simply pushed all the principal out to, year 6 or something like that. So that was the reason for the 10 years. Does that kind of explanation of getting into the reason for the transaction and, why we look at 10 years, is that helpful on that kind of question?
It explains, I think, why you looked at 10 years. I think it explains why you looked at 10 years.
Okay, so let's address the second part of the question then, for the through 2041. So what we would refer you to here is that if you trace through in the benefits of restructuring section, and if you trace on these tabs through, say for example you look at the 5-year debt service and you trace that through and see where that's referencing in this Excel, you'll see that it references the following tab, Exhibit 3.03, the debt service schedules. And you'll see that this is actually a comparison of these two debt service schedules, and these schedules do go all the way through the maturity of the bonds. So what I think we would do is, reference that, we have projected the debt service under both scenarios, under the same basis through maturity, and point to where, where you can find that in the Excel work papers that we've provided. So do you think that would help answer the question?
Okay, so we're referring to this Exhibit 3.03 DS schedules.
Mm-hmm.
And the top part shows status quo. The middle part shows restructured. And is something on that page showing the differences then?
So we haven't done it, but the difference would just be subtracting line 43 in the status quo section and line 101.
In the 101 is negative amounts, so that...
Sorry, actually, what might even be more helpful, Josh just pointed this out to me. We actually do show the comparison in row 103, so it does the subtraction for you there.
With the positive amounts on 103 being...
The positive amounts
higher under the
being,
restructuring or higher under the status quo?
Those represent savings under the restructuring.
So positive means savings?
Correct. So if you look in the first year, the total debt service, including all the fees, is $394 million. That's in row 101. And under the status quo case, the total amount would be $637 million. So that leads to the savings of $243 million.
All right, and there's two groups of years near the end that are lumped here.
Yes, so if you open up, if you expand the columns, so if you expand the columns, that will show the dollar debt service savings.
Okay, so there's some, what I'm trying to figure out how to expand. Are there some hidden columns here then that have it by year?
Yeah, so if you go up to the top, you'll see there is a small plus sign. It's kind of hidden there. The other way is if you highlight rows starting at row EP and extend across and hit Alt-A-J, that'll expand it.
Okay, I've got it. I think it's expanded now.
Yeah, so that gives it to you by year.
Right, it looks like it's actually going out to 2043.
Yeah, so that's because under the status quo schedule, the longest maturities were through 2043.
Right, and when I expanded it, it seems to have a ref designation.
Yeah, I think we see that as well. That's on the per kilowatt hour savings. I think the reason for that is we may not have kilowatt hour projections going out that far, which may be the cause of that. In either case, I think the more relevant number is the debt service savings. You know, we can we can certainly put those over a, some kind of kilowatt hour number if you'd like us to clean up the references. We, have no problem with that, but the number in the row above it should be the relevant one.
Number in row 103?
Correct.
Okay, and that, I think we indicated is the difference between the legacy and the restructured?
Correct. So is this the kind of analysis that you were, that you were looking to see for question 2 here?
Yes.
Okay.
Hempling here. So line 103, why do the savings turn negative in, what year is that, 2030 or so?
So in particular years, because in the status quo schedule, the maturities and the amount of debt outstanding comes down over time, whereas in our revised schedule, it's more of a fixed debt service payments over a longer period of time. It's a smoother debt service profile. So you'll see in the outer years when realistically, under the old schedule, PREPA would probably have been refinancing debt. Here we don't show that. We assume that they would have been able to pay it as it came due, although more than likely they would have been adding additional debt service to help pay it if they were able to do so, if they had market access. So, in some senses, it's very hard to evaluate these outer years because it assumes you get through a lot of maturities.
Yeah. So it's the net present valuing that gives us the net positive because of all the positive figures in the early years. Yep. Thank you.
Which is also, the other thing that we could point to here for this question would be the PV savings test, which also is, addresses that kind of issue.
Right. Okay.
Was that calculated for the entire period somewhere?
The PV savings test, or?
Yes. Yeah, is that on this Excel file somewhere?
Yes, it is.
301.
That is in Exhibit 3.01, or tab EX-301.
All right, and the 867 shown up at the top, are those numbers for the entire period, or is that a truncated period?
That's for the entire period.
Okay.
Okay. Are we good to move on to the next question?
Yes.
Okay. So the next series of questions is in section 3A, so Roman numeral 3A, and then question 1. So a number of these questions deal with similar topics that came up in section in Roman numeral 1, in Roman numeral 1A, where we discussed what the 7.921 was, and also why we wouldn't, that we wouldn't issue 12 billion. So I think what we would, so it's probably helpful if I point you to the question. So the question for 3A1 is page 12 of the petition indicates that one of the benefits of this securitization is that it will in total and on balance reduce PREPA's debt. PREPA's current debt balance is $7.921 billion, and we discussed that that is not its current debt balance. Please explain how a PREPA post-closing debt balance of $12 billion, which we've also discussed, could represent a reduction in PREPA's debt from its current level. So I think the way that we would approach this is to reference the discussion in the earlier questions that we're going to provide, regarding what is PREPA's current debt balance, and as well as the distinction between the the amount authorized, and you've asked for some thoughts about what the higher bounds of that would be, or could be, and how we create a reduction. So would it be responsive then to essentially reference the prior question here, or is there a difference here that we should be responding to that separates this question from from questions 1A1 and 1A2 and the discussions there?
I think the 3A1 could probably be answered by referring back to the responses to 1A1.
Okay.
I think 3A2 is asking a bit of a different question.
Yeah.
That was another one that you wanted clarification on, I think.
Yes. So again, I think this one is asking how could it create savings if all of the bonds were issued. So this is in some senses quite similar to I guess it would be 1A2. Well, what I'm wondering if it makes sense is we will probably reference why in 1A, reference our discussion in 1A2 where we mentioned that we wouldn't be issuing $12 billion of bonds. I think that's probably the most responsive part to this. And then I think the other item we would probably refer to is the limiting factor of the savings test, and that it wouldn't allow us to issue wouldn't allow us to issue bonds if it doesn't create that savings test. So I think that's how we would address it. One thing since we brought up the savings test, there's one other concept that I do want to make sure that we have that everyone understands, so that there's no confusion when we look in the Excel. So if you pull up the Excel and you're looking at the savings test, the savings test only addresses the bonds that are exchanged sort of like for like. So if a given bond at PREPA today is exchanged into an exchange bond, or is tendered in a cash offer bond, then it would be part of this PV savings test. But this PV savings test would not include some of the other bonds, most notably the mirror bonds, because as you're aware, the mirror bonds don't have a change in debt service schedule. The monolines are helping us do this transaction by providing the surety. So there is no change in their debt service schedule. So this only addresses the change in the exchange offer bonds and the cash offer bonds. So we just want to make sure that we're clear that if you were to compare the present value of the debt service amounts in the debt service comparison schedules, that those would be slightly different because it includes other items that are not part of the PV savings test as it's been drafted.
Are the payments to the monolines for the security, the surety that they're providing, are those included in here?
Those are included in the debt service schedules tab, the annual surety premium and the surety replacement. So if you're looking in the Excel, those are rows 95, 96, and also the quarterly fee 97. Those are not part of the PV savings test as it's drafted. Fees are not part of the PV savings test.
Ralph, this is Glenn. When Noah says as it's drafted, I believe he means as the statute is written. The PV savings test is set out in the statute, does not include fees.
So the surety fees are not included in the savings test. What about the 124 million of issuance cost?
That's also not included.
Okay, are the annual debt servicing fees included?
No, the fees are not included. And if it's helpful to see what does flow into the PV savings test, I think we actually so I was just going to reference that what is included in the PV savings test are only the items in 3.0. So if you're
3.01 tab is basically everything.
3.01, yeah, 3.01. Apologies, I misspoke.
All right, I think I see the little plus up at the top to expand those other years.
This is Josh from Millstein. If you're looking at Exhibit 3.01 tab,
Yes.
and the lines 20 and 21, or 25 and 26, 30 and 31, the debt service being in 30 and 31. The two groups labeled ad hoc group and participating non-forbearing bonds.
Yes.
As we mentioned before, depending on whether the the participating non-forbearing bonds are defeased through cash offer, exchange offer bonds, those two groups really only correspond to exchange offer bonds and cash offer bonds. Those are the only two categories as listed in the petition at pages 9 through 10 that are included in the PV savings test.
Just the ad hoc group, which gets the 15% haircut, and any other non-insured bondholders that want to participate, then, which I think is what you mean by the participating non-forbearing bonds?
Correct.
Okay, so you're just basically measuring the bonds that would be exchanged for 85 cents of the face value?
Yes, that's right. So, any more questions on the PV savings test, or should we go back to the questions?
I think we can go back to the question.
Okay. So on 3A2, our thinking was that it would be, again, responsive here to point out that the why under no circumstances would all of the 12 billion be issued, as we mentioned earlier, and then reference the savings analysis that we've included in this working paper that we've gone through, particularly the tab labeled EX 3.03 DS comparison and EX 3.03 DS schedules. Would that be responsive, or is there, is there other commentary you'd like? The other thing that we would do is reference, our earlier discussions about why particular bonds would be issued. So some of the commentary regarding, why would lender bonds be issued? Why would Syncora bonds be issued? Those kinds of concepts that explain, why we would only do so if there were, why doing so would indicate that there would be savings on those amounts.
Yes, I think that would be responsive.
Great. Okay. The next question is in 4B, question 1. So the question here is, this attachment 2.03 shows principal payments during the first 5 years, including 140 million of principal due on 6/30/2017. What is the basis for reflecting principal payments during the first 5 years? So this is something that, the reason we pointed this out is we want to make sure that the concept of mirror bonds are, that everyone's comfortable with that concept. And the reason we say that is that the mirror bonds don't permit us to adjust the repayment schedules. And as a result, if there are currently scheduled principal payments under those mirror bonds due during the first 5 years, we would still have to pay them. If there are currently payments on insured bonds that are outstanding today, and we issue mirror bonds, we would have to still make those payments. So I think we would discuss that. The other piece that we would discuss here is we refer to an item. Yeah, go ahead.
Just a clarification on the mirrored bonds. So they're basically exchanged for new bonds with identical principal and interest payment terms. In other words, when the insured bonds are exchanged for mirror bonds, there's no shifting then of the principal payments in the first 5 years.
That's correct.
Right.
So I think that would be the majority of the commentary. The other item that we would address here, in all likelihood, would be the concept of the 2016 C. And this belongs to the category of other mirror bonds. So as you all are aware, we are in the process and expect to have 2016 A and B bonds issued, which are liquidity relief for an interest payment that was due in January. And our current transaction contemplates a similar resolution in July for the debt service payments due then. We haven't reached. Yep.
And that's C.
That's C. We haven't reached that agreement yet. The schedule that we've shown here is, purely an illustration of what it might look like. But we wanted to include something here that, wasn't overly optimistic and wasn't overly pessimistic. We know that in that negotiation it will be difficult to get a, we don't know what that negotiation is going to turn out to be. So we've included, a principal and interest schedule for it, but we don't know what it will ultimately be. And we, to be conservative, we didn't assume a 5-year interest holiday on those amounts.
5-year principal holiday.
Yeah, correct. 5-year principal holiday. So I think that would be the way we would answer, we would provide that kind of commentary, a clarification of mirror bonds, and then a discussion of, of the other mirror bonds as well. So does that help? Would that help to answer the question?
I think so. That was 4B1.
Yes.
Right. So it's mirror bond principal payments that would have been due on the existing legacy bonds, and you're assuming an issuance of 2016 C bonds to cover a July 1st, 2016 debt service payment with no principal holiday.
Yes, and the color there is this is very near-term liquidity relief that we expect PREPA will need. So the concern is essentially getting through its immediate needs with those bonds, and those we would only issue those to the extent that we need them and are able to do so. And as I say, the payment terms, are we don't have an agreement to extend it. We don't know if we were to get an agreement what the terms would be.
This is Josh again. There's also a principal payment on the 2016 A and B in July 2019, which is one other principal payment that's shown within the first 5 years.
And to that point, that is as agreed to under the current bond purchasing agreement. So we've already, that will be, in some senses, that is quite similar to the existing mirror bonds, in that we are issuing a legacy bonds. We expect those bonds to be issued as legacy bonds in the next couple of days, and they will also be defeased as mirror bonds, again, in the category of other mirror bonds, reflecting a preset schedule of coming due in 2019.
So you're expecting the 2016 A and B bonds to be issued as what, existing as legacy bonds? Are those going to be insured or not?
So they're being purchased by monoline insurers, and they are also being purchased by members of our ad hoc group. Whether or not the bonds that the monolines purchase themselves, whether or not they choose to insure those as well, I'm uncertain of. But this is why they fall under the other mirror bonds concept, that they're newly issued bonds, but they will be issued before, they will be issued as legacy bonds before, obviously before any bonds are issued at the SPV and before they can, which is why they'll then be defeased with mirror bonds.
And I think those were the two issuances at the 10% interest rate, the principal coming due on June 30th, 2019?
That's right. And Josh's point there was the principal is coming due on 2019, so you would see those within the first 5 years.
And I'm trying to recall the terms of those. Was all the principal due on 6/30/19?
Yes.
And then, so you were factoring in an assumption that on June 30th, 2019, that those would be exchanged for other mirror bonds?
No.
No?
We expect. Sorry. We expect that as soon as this transaction closes, that those will be exchanged for other mirror bonds. So our expectation is that those, or rather I should say defeased with other mirror bonds. So because we have to issue these bonds immediately before the corporation is in place, we're initially issuing legacy bonds, but as soon as we are able to do so, we would defease them with other mirror bonds, which would reflect the same principal and interest schedule as the legacy bonds would have, meaning that they would still come due on July 1, 2019.
Right. So the exchange in the mirror bonds that wouldn't wait until 6/30/19. That would occur when?
Under our assumptions in the model here, where we assume a 6/30/2016 close, it would occur on 6/30/2016.
The exchange would occur that day.
Yeah, the defeasance.
Because the bonds will have already been issued. What we're calling the legacy bonds will already have been issued prior to that date.
Correct. That's our expectation.
It's like playing a 9-inning baseball game in 3 innings.
I suppose you could view it that way.
Some people might claim that was an improvement, Scott. Not that I want to offend any baseball fans.
I think I might be the only one you have to worry about, Glenn. But I don't take any offense. All right.
Okay. And I think you mentioned that those are expected to be issued in the next couple of days.
Yeah. We're hoping to have them issued soon. There have been some delays that I don't know that we should get into right now, but some continuing discussions on them, and we expect them to be issued shortly.
I don't want to spend too much time going down a different path, but I guess it looks to us like the letter was sent.
Sorry, someone's shuffling, and I'm having trouble hearing.
Yeah, we received a letter, and I think it was sent by the monolines and the participants in the ad hoc group that were supposed to purchase those bonds. And it expressed concern about a recent piece of legislation in Puerto Rico.
Mm-hmm.
And we weren't sure how to interpret that letter. I mean, it kind of suggested that they were not going ahead with the purchase, but we weren't sure of what the implications of the letter were.
I haven't seen this particular letter. I know that they have expressed some concerns about different about some of some recent legislation that's passed, but I also know that we've worked through those concerns. So if you would like us to if you'd like to request from us an update on on what's going on with the 2016 A and B bonds, we can put something together for you, or we can address that as a separate question if you think that makes sense.
Yeah, I thought we had a question about that in here somewhere. I didn't think it came up on your ones requesting clarification.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's right. So I think we'll probably defer that to our written responses if that's all right.
Yeah, that'll be fine.
Okay.
This is Hempling, but as I understand it, your comment today about expectation of reaching agreement on the legacy bonds is a very recent observation, more recent than the letter.
I think I think that's probably the case. Again, I don't know when the letter was, and again, that's my expectation. Things can certainly change. I would have told you 2 weeks before the letter that I thought we were in agreement and there were no issues, and then things come up. So I wouldn't. There are no guarantees here. I think we should be able to move forward with it, but we'll provide an update, a written update that goes into the detail.
Okay, we can go forward.
Okay, so I think we're on the last question that we wanted to go over, which was 5A2. With regard to the projections of interest and principal provided in the filing, example attachments number 3.01 and 3.03, which of the debt issues listed in the petition at pages 9 and 10 are included in those projections? Please provide supporting documentation. So I think here it probably will make sense for us to reference the mapping exercise that we discussed earlier, as far as mapping which categories we've done. So we may be able to provide that mapping and address it kind of in multi places. I think where that came up was 1A2 and 1A3, and then perhaps somewhere else. Yeah, it looks like actually 1A3, where there's a request for the projected debt service. So I think we would probably refer to both of these questions to the same exhibits.
Ralph?
Yeah, I think that'll be responsive. I think now with this additional spreadsheet and seeing how we can expand it, it looks like we can follow the present value savings test calculation.
Okay, but this actually addresses the projections. Yeah. Oh well, I see. Right. 3.01 also addresses the present value savings projection, and also the broader projection. So we can, we should be able to reference those things. Great.
I think the 3.01 tab on the 2016-04-15 spread. Now that we can expand it and see what you're comparing here, I think that's kind of the type of thing that we were looking for, And then also, how did it relate back to what seemed to be the cumulative potential for issuing the $12.028 billion?
Mm-hmm.
Well,
Yeah,
I think
so
the earlier responses and then to that tab on the spreadsheet should be sufficient to answer that.
Great. Then that's what we'll do. So those are all of the questions that we wanted to clarify and go over. Is there anything else, as long as we're on the phone, that you'd like us to go over, or should we end the call?
This is Hempling. Give me a second, please, to look at some notes.
Sure.
Ralph, anything?
No, I think we've clarified all the questions that the corporation has requested for clarification.
And again, we want to thank you for taking the time to do this, including to go over a little, or a little more than a little. As I'm sure Alejandro will note, we've gone about an hour and 40 minutes, but this has been helpful to us, and I hope as a result it will also lead to answers that fully meet the Commission's expectations, which was really our goal. So thank you all.
Alejandro, anything you need to say for public purposes?
Yes. Once again, I thank everyone for getting on this call and for having a pleasant conversation. So this concludes our clarification call. It is 11:38 a.m. on April 21st, 2016. So thank you all for your time.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.